Thanks for coming, everyone. This has been fun, having these talks here on this porch that has seen so much happen. And tonight, we've been sort of leading towards this. You know, we did the streets, we did the maps, we did the burials, and it's all sort of coming back to the one of the original families from our neighborhood, and the original family that still has a structure. The Dyckmans, and it kind of sounds Western. The Dyckmans, so I thought it would be worth making a movie about. Just kidding, but this is a little fun. Coming soon to a theater near you.
That's great.
But it's appropriate to have some sort of commemoration, even if it's just a 90-second homemade preview, because this is the 100th anniversary of the Dyckman family donating this property to the city. Happened in 1915, and here we are 100 years later, and it's still here, and it's still a great place to be. The city has grown up around us, around this place, but we're going to talk about the family. 4 homes, 6 centuries, 7 generations. So hold on to your hats. There's a lot here. I decided to pull no punches. And so we can, what we're going to do first is we're going to talk about the family, then we'll talk about the homes, and then we'll have we'll talk about the renovation, and then we'll just have a slideshow of whatever photos that I could find of the Dyckman House throughout the 1800s, 1900s. So I always like to talk about where I got my sources. What sources do I use? There's a pamphlet that was originally written for the opening of the Dyckman House. It went through a few editions. I think the last edition may have been 1925. So it tells the story of the renovation and what they knew of the history at the time. Documents and photographs from the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum collection. So thank you to the farmhouse for making that available. Interesting books about our neighborhood, Washington Heights, Its Eventful Past by Reginald, Pelham, Bolton. New Harlem, Past and Present. Sharp's History of Westchester has a great section on Kingsbridge. And then various years of the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society. That was an organization that lasted for a while, but was probably most active at the turn of the century in the first couple of decades of the 20th.
Again, John?
The what?
What was it called again?
The American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society. That's pretty unwieldy, but they picked out many sites around the country, even around the world, and focused attention on renovating them and lobbying on their behalf. And the farmhouse was one of those. And then there's some modern books, a genealogy of the Dyckman family, privately published, and then various things that add context to the renovation and why was the house saved. All right, so we'll take a look first at the overview of where all the homes were. This is the home that has survived the longest. There was a Dyckman house before this, and there were a few Dyckman homes that had been lived in after this, but this is the one that survived. So the first one was a site in the train yards right now, and it's been destroyed. It was destroyed during the Revolutionary War, actually. And that's where the first immigrant and a couple of generations after him, they owned that land and lived there. And then after the Revolution, they built the house that we're on the back porch of now, the William Dyckman Farmhouse, on the newly formed Kingsbridge Road at that time. on this route. And then after a while in the 1850s, they moved from here to a house in Marble Hill. They called it the Yellow House. It was about where, this is the Harlem River pathway now. This is the tiny creek at the time. So this house was destroyed to build the new Harlem River in the 1890s. And then the fourth house was on the site of Baker Field, where the Christie Field House is now. They called it Montdésir. It was built in the 1860s, and it is the final house in Inwood that the Dyckmans lived in. So we have four houses. Just for context, here's the Seaman Drake, where Park Terrace is, and the Isham Park here, and Jan Nagel's house, another early settler, also in the rail yard, where the rail yard is. Okay. Generations of Dyckmans. Let's just do the family tree first. We're going to try and do some graphic. We're going to fill it down to the bottom, and we'll see which houses they lived in. So Jan Dyckman was the immigrant. He had 7 kids with his first wife, and his second wife had 2 children. Jacob Dyckman, or Jacob Dyckman, was going to be the son who was his heir. And
Second marriage.
That's his second marriage, yeah.
Second marriage. What happened to his first wife?
His first wife died.
Okay.
And we'll hear the story. This is sort of a graphical family, so we can see the family tree building. And then his son, William Dyckman, at the end of the Revolution, built the house that we're on the back porch of now, and died just a few years after that. His son Jacobus lived here, born and died in Inwood. And his 2 sons were the heirs jointly. Isaac Dyckman and Michael Dyckman, bachelor brothers, transitional farmers, also involved in schools, civic things, library. They were in one of the committees to form the street, to build the street layout of Upper Manhattan, but not the final one. And they moved to Marble Hill at about 223rd Street in about 1850. And this is one of their sisters who ends up inheriting, her son ends up being the heir because Isaac and Michael didn't have an heir. So their sister's son, James Frederick Smith, changed his name to Isaac Michael Dyckman and inherited. And then the last generation of Dyckmans are the 2 sisters who were the daughters of James Frederick Smith and his wife. They built the house on Baker Field and moved there. And the 2 sisters eventually reacquired and donated the farmhouse to the city. So we can see the progression of generations and homes. And there's one extra little thing here. A little bit of cousin marrying. Jemima Dyckman, her children, one of her granddaughters, I think that's what it would be, was Fanny Blackwood Brown, and she and James Frederick Smith did become husband and wife and were the parents of Mary Alice and Fanny Frederica. All in the family. But neither Mary Alice nor Fanny had children, so the line ends there. Their child was this, giving this house to the city, I guess. Okay, so we're going to take a look back to Jan Dyckman and his world. What's it like to move to New York in the 1600s? This is a map from, it's the Nichols map from around 1664. This is a facsimile copy. I colored in the water. You can see Inwood roughly here. And Jan Dyckman moved to New Harlem, which is actually labeled New Harlem and has a few houses here. And we can see Sherman Creek here, and the Spuyten Duyvil. We can see the low waterlands that would eventually be the cutoff to Marble Hill. So you can see a little bit of stuff. The more you look, the more you see. There are even some dots here that are the waiting place, and it's at 230th Street about, and it says Spittin' Devil in one of those. There are a million spellings of Spuyten Duyvil. All right, so this is what he would, if he actually moved here in that time. Oh, this is a little bit later of New Harlem. So it's a village. He's moving to a village surrounded by forests, pretty much, in North Manhattan. So here's his story. He was born sometime in the 1600s. He died in 1715. That's his signature. He arrived in New Amsterdam between 1662 and 66 from Bentheim, Westphalia, which is now on the border in Germany, but near the Netherlands. And he settled in the new community of New Harlem. And sometime after marrying Madeleine Tourneur, he inherited a plot of land from her father in the vicinity of about 110th to 120th Streets near St. Nicholas. And he began working that land. He joined the militia. He did what everybody does, serve in Indian wars. You cut down trees and try to develop land. And he was good at it. He was good with an axe. And Romer says he helped clear virgin forest for many an acre, now covered with apartment houses. And around 1677, he and a neighbor, Jan Nagel, and a few others were awarded property along the Harlem River north of 211th Street. And Dyckman and Nagel liked the land. Some of the other people who were awarded land didn't like it, so Dyckman and Nagel teamed up and were bought out the other awardees, grantees. Then they leased this new land to a guy named Hendrik Kierson for 12 years. And the reason this is interesting is because the Dyckmans became known for real estate acumen and business practices, and they came up with a very innovative lease. I'll read a little of it. The lessees shall possess and use the lands and meadows the first 7 years free, by paying as an acknowledgement 1 hen every year. The 3 following years, the lessees will pay 150 guilders per year, and the last 2 years pay each 200 guilders. The lessees shall have authority to build and erect houses, barns, and stables to their own satisfaction and contentment, on the condition that at the end of the lease they be delivered over to the owners in good repair. The owners agree to place an orchard with 50 fruit trees, to plant an orchard for the people leasing the land. So in return for development, Dyckman and Nagel are going to plant trees, and in return they'll get a hen a year for a couple of years, but what they're really getting is improvement. Dyckman's wife, Magdalena, died in 1689, and his business partner and neighbor, Jan Nagel, died that year too. And things happen and people fall in love, and the next year, in May of 1690, Dyckman married Nagel's widow and had a second family. And one of the son from their second family became the heir, Jacob. Around 1690, when the hen-a-year lease expired, but definitely by 1711, the Dyckman and Nagel clan moved from Harlem up to some structure, probably the structure that they had leased, had reacquired in Inwood, near the present-day 210th Street, east of 9th Avenue, where the MTA yards are. Rebecca died in 1719, and their son Jacob continued to live in Inwood and manage the estate after him. Later, in 1699, more land was divided, and Jan drew Tract 24, which included about half of the Inwood Valley from Sherman's Creek across to Tubby Hook and northward, with the instruction that he build a suitable King's Way. So he had to build a road, and it added 150 acres to his holdings. This is the tip of Marble Hill. You can see the orchards are up there. Well, this is sort of possibly an apocryphal story, but it's humorous. You know, Nagel and Dyckman, you know, they're business partners, they're neighbors. There are going to be little disputes, okay? So this poet, this is an apocryphal story, but you never know. The Nagel goose strayed onto the Dyckman corn and was bitten by the Dyckman dog. For a time, the feeling aroused by this episode was so bitter that the transaction of public business was hampered by the refusal of the heads of the two houses to sit on the same administrative board. But the breach was soon healed. But they did build a fence, and here's the fence line from a Bolton scrapbook, the old rock fence between the Dyckman and Nagel farms. And up at the top of the hill, you can see the Isham estate. This is from the Bolton scrapbook in the Dyckman Farmhouse collection. There's the Seaman Drake over there. All right, the second generation, Jacob, was the elder child, only son of Jan Dyckman's second marriage. And his parents, since they were married in Spuyten Duyvil and lived there after their marriage, Jacob was doubtless born there. I don't think he lived there all the time, but he did come and go and eventually came back. And but he is sort of responsible for, in a way, the Free Bridge, the Dyckman Bridge, the Farmers Bridge, this bridge, the second bridge out of Manhattan. But the story is this: in 1756, a guy named Benjamin Palmer proposed a toll-free bridge into Manhattan to compete with the King's Bridge at 231st Street that charged a toll. So to get in, to get out, you had to pay a toll if you wanted to just ride. So they considered this as a business transaction to compete with the King's Bridge, and they could have a tavern, and that would probably be a popular tavern. So he proposed this, and Palmer, this is the Old English, he took in Dyckman and Vermilion in partnership because they had land on each side of the river where the bridge should be landed. And Thomas Vermilion helped Jacob Dyckman and his son build the free bridge by making his land across the Harlem River available so they could land it on each side. And the bridge opened around January 2nd or New Year's Day in 1759. It was the first toll-free road into Manhattan. And to celebrate, thousands of New Yorkers from both mainland and city attended a party on the green near the bridge and dined on roast oxen. So this is the bridge probably around 1900 from a postcard. And when he died, Jacob left his property to his third son, William. Not his first, but it was part of a tradition of leaving the family affairs in the hands of who the father thought would be the most capable. Not necessarily the oldest. Okay, so here's the road that they built. It's not the Broadway that we know now. This is from a painting. This is the several homes that would have been the outbuildings, probably the barn, and maybe a home for a couple of generations of Dyckmans. And involved in politics. This is a record from the session of the General Assembly of the Colony of New York. In 1752, they say that this General Assembly was held at the house of Jacob Dyckman in the Outward of New York, begun on the 24th of October, 1752, and continued by diverse adjournments to the 11th of November. And so it would have been perhaps just an easy way to get people coming in and out of the island, or for whatever reason, some politics happened here. All right, third generation is William. William built this house that we're in now. A quiet, conservative, reliable farmer. He worked on the farm with his father and inherited the Dyckman lands when his father died. And 4 of his sons fought in the war for American independence. And the Dyckman farm, being here by Fort Washington, lay in a strategic position on the northern end of Manhattan. And in 1775, the winds of change, things were looking like there was going to be a war. The New York Provincial Committee recommended fortifications on the hills that overlooked Dyckman land. And these events convinced William that he and his family should skedaddle. So they left to a place I don't know where they went, but safely to the north. And exactly when they left is not known, probably around May 12th, for by June the entire northern end of Manhattan works were being constructed. Little of an edible nature on the farm after the war was spared. One by one, every tree on the property was felled for huts, barracks, barricades, campfires. The fine woods and orchards on the Dyckman farm were swept away, says Bolton. And sometime before the British troops left, probably before 1782, the old Dyckman homestead was burnt to the ground. Here's an advertisement. Stray cows at William Dyckman's Inwood Farm from 1788 came to the enclosure of the subscriber near Kingsbridge on or about the 15th of November. 2 stray cows, one with red and one with a white face, the other brown, colored with white spots. Whoever claims said cows may have them again by proving property and paying charges. William Dyckman. Well, he returned to the farm after the war. He found his home in ruins, his orchards destroyed, and a new road, now Broadway, laid out for military use, cutting across his lands north of Dyckman Street. And upon this road, which is at now 204th Street, he rebuilt his home. It seems probable that he reused some material, since raw material wasn't so easy to come by, no easy hardware store to go to. And he probably built it sort of along the lines of what the old house had been like. And they continued to reside here, using those acres which spread out until down to the river for grazing lands for the cattle driven to New York. He died in 1787 just after living in his home just 3 or 4 years. So by 1790, the census reads that Widow Dyckman is the head of the household, consisting of 1 male, 16 or over, 3 females, and 7 slaves. 5 years later, after the settlement of the estate, her eldest son, Jacobus, sold his property upstate and returned to take over the farm. His mother continued to live there until her death. And after William Dyckman died, of course the family has to figure out what to do. Are we going to stay? Are we going to go? His son had been elsewhere and came back after his father died, and they decided to sell. William Dyckman would have been dead for about 4 months when this advertisement was placed. He was the youngest living son, still on the premises. He would have been about 25, and Jacobus would have been oldest. William's will says that the farm should remain in the family until the death of his mother. So this ad turned out to be premature. 1788, can't really sell until 1802 when she died. So this was premature, shall you say. They put the ad out and then they took it down and they decided to not sell. And Jacobus decided to stay. Seems to have had as much of an inquisitive ability as his forebears for land and farming during his long occupancy in the farmhouse. He added considerably to the property by purchasing the Courtright Farm south of Sherman Creek, and he added land north of his homestead, including parts of Marble Hill. He was highly esteemed by his neighbors and friends who sought his advice on matters of property, farming, and politics. Yeah, he became influential and well known. They were really building a gosh, what do you call it? That's the word, a dynasty. During the early days of the Revolution, Jacobus was faced with the unsavory choice of either selling his produce and livestock to the occupying British forces or risk it just being stolen. So he decided to sell. And when the occasion arose that the goods were indeed taken without compensation, he managed to negotiate. The guy is a good negotiator. He managed to negotiate with the British for payment. Romer says he was a big, powerful man and a blacksmith. He returned to Inwood in 1793. We heard about that, and inherited the estate. So here's what it looks like in 1820 here. Jacobus is the head. We have a daughter of Jacobus's brother, James Frederick Smith, who ended up changing his name to Isaac Michael Dyckman, and 3 brothers, Michael, Isaac, and Jacob. He became a doctor. And then several people, either named or unnamed, slaves or servants. A free black woman, free black boy, one enslaved male, and an unknown white female. But in New York, many slaves were freed by 1827, and in the 1840 census, there were no slaves in New York. So it was the beginning of the 1800s. There were probably a good number, and then each decade hence, there were less and less. All right, Isaac and Michael, 2 brothers, lived frugally, worked hard, wherever possible, bought farms. Michael died first in 1854 and willed his share of the farm to Isaac, and when Isaac died, the estate covered about 400 acres or more. It extended east to west from the Harlem River to the Hudson and in some places from atop Fort George to the end of Marble Hill to the north, one of the largest estates ever assembled in Manhattan. And for many years, cattle driven from Putnam and Westchester counties to market had made the Dyckman Acres their last stopping place. They were allowed to graze here for 25 cents a head per night. And the presence of all this cattle and the drovers and other personnel so close to the homestead brought its problems, so the family moved to the home in Marble Hill. Kept this place as a farmhouse, and just it was rented for a while. This house, the house they moved to in Marble Hill, was called the Yellow House, torn down when the ship canal was cut through the Dyckman Meadow to straighten the course of Spuyten Duyvil Creek. But Isaac Dyckman was he was interested in civic and city things like libraries and schools and improvements. And so he deeded the land for Public School 52 across the street to the city at Broadway Academy. That was originally Dyckman land. He gave it to the city. Someone has recalled that once, at least on one occasion, children lined up on both sides of the street when he passed, saluting and curtsying to honor their benefactor. They were buried at the Nagel Dyckman Burial Ground on 212th Street in our neighborhood, and their nephew, James Frederick Smith, had lived with them since boyhood, as in the family here. He was a third or fourth child, so he didn't have a lot of prospects, and so they thought that it was good to, he seemed to have uncles that liked him. He seemed to share their interests, and so he wound up living here and being the heir. All right, the Dyckman brothers were social activists in the neighborhood. The Dyckman Institute, organized in 1818 as the Hamilton Free School, an early school between here and 181st Street, halfway up the hill, something like around there. And the school was originally located on Broadway between 187th and 188th. It did burn down, and then this school was funded. The land was given to the city, and here's the gift of land in the Journal of the Board of Ed in 1857. This is the original building of what's now IS 52. And they founded the first library in Inwood. Here it is on top of Inwood Hill in a home, free reading room. And 1860, an act for an incorporation of a Dyckman library in the city of New York. And this is what Broadway looks like at that time. Here's the Dyckman House in the 1860s. And here's School 52. And this building, trustees of the Dyckman Library, it says. Active in faith, Isaac. The Mount Washington Presbyterian Church, now in a different building on Vermilion. And involved in city planning, even though this didn't really come to fruition. Isaac Dyckman was on the committee that was appointed to lay out the portion of the city lying north of 155th Street. Andrew Green was the guy who actually got it done, but he was interested enough to accept this, and they had some meetings. Who knows what really happened? Okay, and Isaac Michael Dyckman, our 6th generation Dyckman. He lived in 3 different Dyckman houses. This one here that we're in now, the one in Marble Hill, and the one that he built at the site of the Bakerfield site. Around 1820, as a 7-year-old, he moved into this farmhouse to live with his grandfather, Jacobus, and his uncles, Isaac and Michael. He had been born in Yonkers, one of 10 children of Hannah Dyckman Smith, and he grew up in the farmhouse, worked with his uncles. In October 1867, his uncle Isaac turned over some property to see what he would do. And just a year later, his uncle died, I think, in 1868. He then began construction of his own home in preparation for his marriage. He was an older guy getting married, 54 years old. He married his distant cousin, his 35-year-old Fanny Blackwell Brown Dyckman. And just a month after they were married, his uncle died, his uncle Isaac and benefactor. Isaac left a complex and detailed will. He dictated that the bulk of the family property, including the farmhouse, be auctioned off. This farmhouse. He also left specific bequests to James with an important caveat. He was given 1 year to change his name to Isaac Michael Dyckman. If he failed to do so, the bequests would be revoked. And so, on March 20th, 1868, James Frederick Smith legally became Isaac Michael Dyckman. And in return, he inherited money, possessions, and land on the Upper East Side, Lower Manhattan, and Yonkers. He and his wife had a couple of daughters, and these two daughters bought this farmhouse, saved it from the wrecking ball, and ensured its preservation. So here's Isaac Michael and Fanny. And after Isaac and Michael, the uncles, died, the heir is part of his job was to manage land and help disperse money and things like that. So that this sale at auction, the very first sale of the estate in 1868, was one of 4 auctions. And here are the 4. The first one is mostly all south of Dyckman Street, and some even up on Fort George, Nagle Avenue. You can see that the streets are being named at this time. Second auction is east of Broadway. Third auction is along the Harlem River. And the last auction, including the farmhouse, is west of Broadway, heirs of Iceland. So 1868, 2 auctions in 1870, 1 auction in 1871. And now we reach our last generation of Dyckmans, the sisters, both probably born at the Baker Field House, Mullen Desir. 3 stories, we'll see pictures of it later. At age 24, Mary Alice married Bashford Dean. Bashford Dean, the curator at the Metropolitan Museum and at the American Museum of Natural History. And age 25, Frida married Alexander Macmillan Welch, an architect. So you can start to see already, there's a little foreshadowing. One sister married a curator, one sister married an architect. It takes a curator and an architect to build a museum. Oh, they're neighbors, they're my family, we're married to them. So in the fall of 1915, they purchased their father's childhood home. With the arrival of the subway and the pressure of development, houses like this were endangered, and the purchase was made with the understanding that the house would be fully restored and donated to the city as a museum. So without these 2 ladies, this house would certainly be just another apartment building. So here's Mary Alice and Bashford Dean, ichthyologist and an armor expert, and Fanny Frederica and Alexander Macmillan Welch. So that is our family tree. Now let's go back and take a look a little bit more at what we know of these houses. Here are the 4. Original homestead, believed to have been built around 1680, says Bashford Dean, destroyed during the American Revolution. And who lived here? Jan, Jacob, 4 generations of Dyckmans lived here in this little complex of homes. Here in the distance, we can see what's likely the Courtright farm, and here would possibly be probably the Nagle farm. And so this is a well-known painting from November of 1776. You can see soldiers fighting. This is somebody who painted this during the actual battle. And it's the only views that we really have of the original Dyckman homesteads. And here they are on a topo map from 1777. And this is probably Courtright. I don't see Nagle here. Here's the Dyckman Bridge, the King's Bridge. And if you notice, Kingsbridge Road follows the waterway. It doesn't come here yet. So here's the painting that shows the Dyckman House in the midst of the Battle of Fort Washington. And here we are on a map, the colonial dwellings. You can see that they're a block apart. This one, according to Bolton, this is the Jacobus Dyckman home, and the other Dyckman homestead, probably the original one. Just two generations of families, and here's the Nagels. And this would have been, Bolton would have decided that these were here by excavations, which we'll find out a little bit about later. And here's the burial ground where the families were buried. In 1904, Bolton and others excavated this site of the original farmhouse at 210th Street, and they found structural pieces of iron and other bits of stuff. Here's something from the newspapers of the day. A few photos of people hacking away in the way those early archaeologists did. A pair of old glasses. And where was the debris? Sounds a little fuzzy. Where was the debris left? It was left, the original Dyckman property excavation debris, according to this Bolton historical map, was dumped in 1905 along the north side of Dyckman between Post and Sherman. You can see here, note the debris filled here in 1905 from the Dyckman dwelling, 208th and 9th Street. All right, so here's Nagel and Dyckman, or maybe that's a Dyckman, but anyway, to the south of the Dyckmans, to the north of the Nagels. The original route of the Kingsbridge Road up to Kingsbridge. Here's the ox party for the Kingsbridge, of Freebridge. I keep looking for information about how the Dyckman houses were destroyed. And here's a map from the Library of Congress that does appear to show, here's Sherman Creek and Tubby Hook, and it does appear to show, oh, that's good, the Dyckman houses here, and with an interesting note, it says, houses burnt by the rebels. Houses burned by the rebels. Now, I don't know what that really means. Does that mean that people fighting for independence thought that this was too valuable an asset of raw material and burned it down in advance? Or was it a scavenger, like a raid that was being used by a headquarters? I don't really know what the story is. You can come up, use your imagination. But the fact that this says houses burnt by the rebels, if a scholar were to say, yeah, okay, this looks like it's where the Dyckmans are, well, there's a little hint as to maybe what happened.
Hey, John?
Yeah.
Who made that map and made that notation?
That's a Reginald Pelham Bolton's map in the American, oh, that map here.
Well, the one that notes that it was burned by the rebels.
This one is in the Library of Congress.
Do you know who made it?
And there's no maker listed, but if you look for Fort Washington, you'll find a number of maps, and this will be one of them. I would have tried to add more if I could have, but
The reason why I asked is because the term "burned by the rebels" sounds like it was someone who was British who wrote that. If someone was American, they might say "burned by patriots."
yeah.
Something like that.
The conventional wisdom is that it was burned by the British. So I guess it's a matter of interpretation, but the fact that it says it was destroyed somehow, I think it's interesting. I would like to learn more about that. All right, and here's Nagel's home, and in 1782 on the British headquarters map, there's no Dyckman residence. And here are all the desire lines that went through the neighborhood. One of them turned into the new Broadway. We don't really have to dwell on this much. But here's the new path, the present path. And they built this house, 1784, about. Home of 4 generations of Dyckmans, currently administered by the Parks and the Historic House Trust and the Dyckman Farmhouse and Museum Alliance. And here we are on Bolton's map. It didn't start out looking the way it does now. The first phase, this is Susan DeVries's breakdown of it. The first phase of construction, believed to have begun when the family returned after the Revolution, and the early version of the house included the exterior walls, but most likely didn't include a front or rear porch. And on the interior, ladders would have been used to reach the kitchen below this window and a sleeping space above in a large loft-like area. First floor would have had 3 rooms, a north and south parlor, this parlor and that parlor, and a third large space stretching across the rear. This home's evolution, of course, is going to continue, so afterwards, after the initial construction, more interior partitions are added, a wall between the kitchen and the cellar downstairs, and to separate the first floor, the rear of the first floor, into these 2 separate bed chambers that are here. Yeah?
The map you just showed us, it said 1787 on it? One map.
Yeah. Dates sometimes change, but it's the commonly accepted date is 1784 now. On an old map by Sackersdorf in the Blue Book, this is his drawing of the Dyckman Farmhouse. It doesn't have a porch. You can see how the land is sloping. It's up to, I don't think this is super realistic because there are windows in the second floor and all that stuff in the front. But I like the lay of the land, and I think it might mean that Sackersdorf actually came by here when he made the drawing. All right, by 1819, a front and a back porch was, the front and rear porch was in place, and the gambrel roof was probably over it, and the summer kitchen was added. It appears in Randall's sketch in 1819, and the interior changes probably included removing ladders, adding stairs instead of ladders, and making the house a little more divided into private spaces. Welch and Dean speculate that this summer kitchen here, which is currently the Caretakers Cottage, actually predates the Revolutionary War and may have been moved here later. They claim that it might have been a foreman's cottage and relocated from the 210th Street property. The Historic American Building Survey gives this a date of 1725. And so if we look for evidence for that, during the 2003 restoration, it was discovered that on the ground floor, the basement, there's a window on the south side that this wall just kind of is covering up. So the original farmhouse probably had a window here, and then this was moved. It may be earlier construction, but moved here later, if that makes any sense. And then a northern annex was added in the 1820s or 1830s and stood until the renovation in 1915. Had 1 room on the inside, possibly used for servants. Regular bedrooms and stuff. And here we are on the map on 1811. We'll go fast. This is John Randall's survey sketch for the New York Historical Society. And let's take a closer look. This is a little fuzzy, isn't it?
Plug it back in.
All right. A little better. So here's do I have the animation? Yeah, good. So here's Randall's sketch in ink, and we can see the Dyckman farmhouse with the summer kitchen, with a corn crib, a fence. This is translating what the script is. A barn here, cider mill, and a creek, wall, and a lot of surveying measurements. And here's the road, Broadway. In his final map, this is what it looks like after he's done with his paint brushes. And if you compare the size of this structure to other houses along Broadway, this is actually a very large house. Cabbages. And here's this is the earliest drawing of the house. By 1835, we can see the northern addition has been built. And we can see that Inwood is being used for as a source for marble. Kingsbridge, Marble Hill. Valuable discovery of Kingsbridge white marble quarry here in 1805, answering the full and extensive specifics of monuments, tombs, gravestones, etc. And on this map from 1821, we see marble quarries, marble mills, lime kilns. So this was a neighborhood for mining. And by the 1860s, it's a rental property. So here we have our map. Here's the farmhouse with its formal garden. But still a farmhouse. And here in 1866, we were looking south on Broadway. Here's the school number 52. And by now, this is a rental property, and the Dyckmans have moved up to Marble Hill. But it has not been sold by them yet. Here's the earliest photo we have of the farmhouse. And what's really cool about this? Broadway is at level of the stairs. By the 1880s and 1890s, the plans for all the streets had been made, and sometime around then, maybe 1890-ish, Broadway's grade was lowered because if the hill was too steep, up or down, horses and buggies and what they predicted for increased traffic was going to be having trouble in rainy days and icy weather. So they graded the hills away to make streets pretty flat. So this would have been lowered quite a bit, however many feet that is, 10 or 15 feet. Here's a drawing from 1875, also shows you, this is really, it gives you a feel for the country road aspect of the house. And it became a subject of artists. Frederick Leo Hunter came up. This is the northern edition. He painted a lot of it. From the south, from the north. Oh, that's from the south. Two from the south, front and back. Now we can see a small back porch. These are at the New York Historical Society. George Plowman etching. And here by 1890s we can see that Broadway has been regraded and the road is much lower. And around 1915, when the house is actually given to the city, this is around that time, just before the restoration. This is actually the back of the farmhouse, and the rear porch has fallen down and been demolished for whatever reasons. It wore out. You can see the line of the porch where the porch would have been because it's plastered below that line, and this would have been where the gambrel roof, just bare brick, would have been covered up by wood and the wooden extension of the gambrel roof. This is the demolished northern addition. Close up. And that's an interpretation of it. And some photos from the Museum of the City of New York. Front, back, and from the south looking north, you can see the city's definitely here. Fire plug. And this would have been right before the renovation. Okay, so the Yellow House, there's not a lot that we can tell you about it because there aren't a lot of pictures, or I don't think it was architecturally a fantastic place, but a small stone and frame building situated on the south side of Marble Hill, 350 feet east of Broadway on the steep hillside, now cut away by the railroad and the canal. The building was said to have been erected in 1910, but not by the Dyckmans, built by the heirs of William Nagel. And to this dwelling, the Dyckman family moved around 1850, and in it, Isaac Dyckman, the uncle, passed away in 1868. Here's a little look of from Scientific American's cover of the grading of the Harlem River, turning the Spite and Dival Creek into the river that we see today. And here, precariously perched, is the Dyckman House. This,
What year is that from?
this is 1890.
22 March 1890?
Yeah. And here we can see it on Bolton's historic map. Broadway Bridge. Here's an early view from 1819. Marble Quarry, Kingsbridge, 1819. And from Valentine's Manual of 1861, here we have it with all the outbuildings. The residence of Isaac Dyckman, Kingsbridge, 1861. He was actually living there at this time. And the first version of our Broadway Bridge. And there's our house. If you look, I can't remember what it says on the side. I think rooms to let or something like that. Oh. And here it is again, hard to see, with the foundry and the swing bridge of Spite and Dival. And the only photographs I've ever seen are on a postcard. And even on the postcard, they're not very clear, but these are 3 photos after the river had been widened. You could see it just, I mean, you don't want to go out that back door. Unless you want to go swimming. Here it is. Final days as a boarding house. By then, the Dyckmans were gone. And here it is in a photograph in 1902, right before work began on the Marble Hill Cutoff to fill that in. But by then, there was only Isaac Michael Dyckman and his wife and family. His daughters, and Mondesir is anything but a farmhouse. Located on 218th Street, built in 1867. Isaac Michael lived there until 1899, and the property was sold in 1904. And it eventually became property of Columbia University for use by the athletic department. And it was used until it was demolished in 1949. So here we are. 218th Street, here's Seaman Drake. Here's the 1884 rendition from Scharf, History of Westchester. Hot houses. And here's when it was under Columbia's management, used by the athletic department, the crew, locker rooms and things up in it. This is from the Columbia Archives. Manor House and Showers, Bakerfield. Always some interesting stories. In the Caretakers Cottage, it was used by field personnel at Columbia. And this guy, Wyatt Webb, he lived in this house, and he remembers, in this article, remembers watching games from his bedroom window. Whoa! But was the manor house haunted? The old structure is likely to be demolished. There are supposedly ghosts. 4 famous bygone grid coaches is a funnier sight than the ghost is generally regarded, because when it emerges from the manor house at Bakerfield, it's said to be tricked out in a Columbia bandsman's ornate outfit. But it's sort of that the house became a joke, and here's the director of athletics in 1945 saying, "That's right, the old house has outlived its usefulness and will be the first thing to go when we get around to rebuilding up here." And they give a little history, but that is all just for reference. You can always talk about that more. Columbia really didn't like it after it had outlived its usefulness, and here's a promotional brochure for a new building, a new stadium, a new field house. And what's wrong with this picture? Nothing that can't be fixed. Tear it down. And so here's pictures of the demolition and the building of the new Christie field house. And the president of Columbia at the time was Eisenhower. And so here he is with the first ceremonial shovelful of sod for the new Christie field house, with the Mont Désir in the background, and slowly being demolished, and the new field house taking place. And
So pretty.
Who's the architect? Do we know who this is?
I can tell you that, but it's on a different slide and I don't have it memorized. But I can find that out for you. All right, so now we got to restore this farmhouse. So why? I guess it's sort of extraordinary that the building survived. For decades, this old house weathered the storms of urban development, neglect. The orchards were plowed under to make way for apartment houses. New subway lines ran under its foundation. This is a quote from this book, Dutch New York. Yet three converging trends of the early 20th century helped save it. One is efforts launched by genealogical and historical groups to save landmarks, and increasingly aggressive efforts to professionalize American museums, and at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, a great interest in all things Dutch colonial. Hudson Fulton celebration, the 300th anniversary of Henry Hudson, was a really big deal in this town. Huge, huge festival. They even came up with ideas for a bridge where the Henry Hudson Bridge is now. This is one idea. Linked to several reform movements in New York, in addition to progressivism, were the conservation and preservation movements, which led to the creation of the Historical Preservation Society. So there's a lot of looking at things that might be disappearing and prioritizing and trying to get things saved. Holland Mania was taking place from 1880 to 1920. We mentioned that. Even in the Ladies' Home Journal announced an editorial to millions of readers that Holland, not England, was the motherland of the United States, citing evidence of colonial Dutch influence in American politics. Even language, the editorial concluded that all truly American ideals originated in the Netherlands. And so a Dutch house is part of, you kind of might want to save a Dutch house if you're just learning about this stuff. So, but the idea itself to preserve the house didn't come from the Dyckmans themselves. It came from some other family, John and Winifred Judge, two historically minded New Yorkers who purchased the Dyckman House around 1913 with an eye towards restoring it. And working with the city, this is from Dutch New York, the Judges hoped to move the house from here to Isham Park, which was already a park by 1914. And but Winifred Judge died unexpectedly in 1914, and the project fell apart. And it was then that the Dyckman sisters stepped in, purchased the house and the surrounding half-acre in 1915, and kept the idea alive for city, museum, and park. And this is the Judge family's proposal. The present Dyckman House is now owned by Mr. and Mrs. John H. Judge. They bought it several years ago from the purchaser of the old place at one of the Dyckman auctions. It fell into good hands because they want to restore it. And the sisters did ride to the rescue. Here in the New York Times, 1915, the farm building will be completely restored by the donors. The Dyckmans are going to pay, so the city doesn't have to. So the city will accept the gift. And at the dedication in 1916, Cabot Ward, Parks Commissioner, says, "It is with a great deal of satisfaction that I take this opportunity of accepting the Dyckman Farmhouse and Park in behalf of the New York City, of the City of New York. I believe that in the future annals of this city, it will be considered an important milestone." And then he talks about how generous the Dyckmans have been and how easy they are to work with. And he promises that in return, a ceaseless endeavor by the Parks Department to maintain this splendid gift in a manner befitting its worth. Okay, but the challenge is really up to the Dyckmans to get this job done. And their challenge was to turn a shabby old house into something the city actually wanted. So Mary Alice is married to Bashford Dean. Bashford Dean, one of the nation's Bashford Dean isn't in this picture. Museum professionals, and Fanny Frederica was married to Alexander McMillan Welch, a preeminent architect. Between them, Dean and Welch steered the museum into existence. They restored and reinterpreted the house. So restoration work began in 1915, and just a year later, less than a year later, the farmhouse was open to visitors. So this was a quick renovation. They probably devoted almost full time to this. Interior and exterior features, if they were really old, they were retained as much as possible. The work was no doubt greatly influenced by the colonial revival movement at the time, which resulted in a kind of a romantic notion of colonial life. I mean, you look through the farmhouse now, and it is interpreted in that way. It's not so much a farmhouse as a house with nice furnishings. So they had to decide what time period to restore it to. They chose to interpret it as it might have been from 1850 to 1820, which meant demolishing the newer northern addition and recreating the interior and finding family furnishings to reflect that home's early residential use years rather than the farmhouse years. And here's McMillan Welch's blueprints. We're going to see a lot of these architectural elements and elevations. Gates, hardware, lampposts, lists and lists of parts, basement hardware for doors and shutters, gardening, proposals, they drew the north addition, which had been removed. Thank goodness. This is in a sense, a good beginning of the archaeologists of today, recording before you destroy. Elevation with no back porch, and then interiors. I mean, so much work in just a year. Now we can see they did it just in time, because within less than 10 years later, big apartment buildings are starting to go up. Found these. We'll take a tour of some of the inside now, just a little bit. These old signs in the basement from old days. Bits of this is underneath the gambrel roof, up in the attic. Chimney slants so that it can be from the parlor room up towards the center chimney. Ancient timbers. And we'll take a little bit of a look at the Hessian Hut, which is just down the hill here. It was originally part of a Revolutionary War encampment, probably Hessian hired soldiers along Payson Avenue. It was moved here. This is Payson Avenue that archaeologists found, I don't know, 50 of these huts? I don't know how many. And in one of them, they found a great fireplace. And so here, you can see it says that the hearth, the removed to Dyckman House stone hearth. So that became the hearth in our recreation of the hut. Here they are excavating it. There's the fireplace as in situ. And you can see the stones measured, drawn, so they could be moved and replaced and built. This is what Cooper Street looked like. You can see behind the hut, house and a barn, a hill, and a lot of the marble. Inside. Here's Bolton, our historian and architect and engineer himself. There's Cooper Street and a house. And this is from Cooper Street looking towards the Dyckman House in the 30s. Going to be going through a lot of photos now. Here it is being renovated in 1968. It gets a new roof like every building eventually has to. And now we're going to take a look at just an evolution of the house in photographs, starting from its beginnings. It's newly restored. This is from Francis Hamilton Dyckman's glass slide collection that he kept from his family before his grandmother or mother. And these were all glass slides. And in a lot of them, you can kind of suspend the passage of time because it doesn't look that much different. Some special occasion here because this is a 13-star flag. You can see bits where the glass is broken. It's hard to believe this is 100 years ago. This looks different, but so a lot of these, I think a lot of these are just photos that were taken shortly after the house opened or in the first few years in order to just record what it was like. This is the winter kitchen, currently the Caretakers Cottage. Well, I mean, the summer kitchen is the Caretakers Cottage. And Norman Rockwell got in there sometime after 1916, and he painted it. This is when he was, probably when he was I don't really know how old he would have been, but he was a young man, and for part of his youth, his family lived in Washington Heights, so this probably would have been done before he was Norman Rockwell, for sure. This is the one view that seems to me to have, take that grandfather clock away, and this could be a farmhouse. It has a farmhouse feel to it. You can see leaves blown against that lower step. The recreated well, which was on the property at the beginning of the restoration. We'll stop here because of this. Before the horseless carriage took over the city, there was a time when things coexisted, and here's a buggy being pulled by a horse, headed down Broadway. In 1967, in July, the Dyckman Farmhouse was awarded New York City landmark status, and later that year, National Historic Landmark. It's the only landmarked building in Inwood. There are some landmarked lampposts and a gas light. But here's the dedication in 1968. This plaque used to be mounted into the wall of this back porch. Sometime in the 70s or 80s, it walked away. Band playing fife, probably a fife and drum corps. And the 60s, 80s. We are almost to the present. So I guess what's left to do is to just recap, because we've seen a lot. All these generations, from Jan, Jacob, William, Jacobus, the two brothers, the nephew, the daughters, 4 houses, and our neighborhood's witness, I guess. Thanks for coming.